I remember that evening with the peculiar clarity reserved for things that never quite belonged to the ordinary world. The fog had rolled in from the river with an almost ecclesiastical stillness, drifting between the archways as though reluctant to settle anywhere for long. I'd walked through St. Anselm's with the half-conscious intention of escaping myself, though Oxford, as always, insisted on putting its own ghosts in front of mine. The stone glistened faintly under the lamps, and the faintest echo of an organ practice carried across the quad, hesitant as if the player doubted each chord before releasing it. A porter nodded at me with the guarded reverence these places cultivate. On the notice board behind him hung the announcements for the high table feast, each invitation written in an elegant, overconfident hand. One, however, caught my eye. Someone had taken a fountain pen and drawn a severe black line across it, withdrawn. The word seemed less like a correction than a wound. I asked the porter whether there had been a change of plans, but he answered in the polite evasions of college folk, the sort that imply a truth better left aerated for several days. I let it pass. There are times one must allow silence to speak first. The evening carried a faint metallic cold as I crossed the quad. I had been thinking of nothing more consequential than the way the chapel window smuggled out its weak glow when the sharp vibration of my phone broke through the quiet. Strange rarely called at that hour, unless he wanted something buried before the newspapers could warm their presses. His voice, carrying that unusual blend of hesitation and impatience, mentioned a student from St. Anselm's found dead earlier in the afternoon. Suicide, they said. I had heard enough official suicides in my life to feel an instinctive recoil from the word. It is used too casually, like a coat thrown onto any hook when the room is dark. Lewis met me by the college gate, his breath rising like pale threads against the fog. He told me they wanted the matter kept discreet, which meant someone feared embarrassment more than truth. As we walked down the narrow staircase toward the student staircase room, I felt the subtle shift in atmosphere one always notices just before stepping into a space touched by death. Something slowed, something retracted. The room itself was painfully neat. Too neat, if I'm honest. Books arranged with a precision I would never trust in a young man. Papers stacked, pens aligned, bed made with boarding school tightness. Even the air felt organized. What jarred, however, was the crossword lying on the desk. Half completed, one clue attempted, crossed out, rewritten incorrectly. I remember thinking that mistakes made by the newly dead often speak louder than their accuracy. Lewis, ever gentle in such rooms, said he had found no note. I felt the absence was like a physical thing. No note, no shattered objects, no impulsive flourishes that hinted at chaos. Just a room designed to imitate tranquility. My eyes drifted to the surface of the desk, where an invitation to the high table feast lay torn cleanly in half. A tear without hesitation, the kind of gesture that carries a private grammar. Outside the window, the fog pressed closer, softening the world beyond into indistinguishable shapes. I asked Lewis whether the college had explained the torn invitation, but he said they hadn't. They rarely explained anything until cornered. I told him to look for missing letters, diaries, anything that might disrupt the tidy facade. He nodded and stepped aside while I returned to the crossword, tracing the faint indentation of the pencil strokes. A miswritten clue often reveals a person's final preoccupation, or their final fear. As I left the room, the corridor gave a faint creak as though adjusting under the weight of some hidden unease. I paused by the notice board outside, where the student's name had been modestly pinned among society rosters and outdated lecture lists. The lamps flickered in their weary attempt to light the hallway, casting the sort of shadows that remind a man how fragile our small structures of order really are. Somewhere above us, a door shut with deliberate softness, and though I didn't yet know why, the withdrawn invitation, with its black slashed ink, stayed with me like an unanswered question, one that would lead, inevitably, into darker corners of this sleepless college. I've often thought that the most unsettling rooms are not the ones marked by violence, but those that have been carefully composed to deny it. When Lewis and I returned to St. Anselm's the next morning, the fog had surrendered to a pale drizzle that clung to the stone like a quiet reproach. The college looked absurdly peaceful, as if determined to disclaim any connection to the unease I'd felt the night before. Yet the staircase leading to the deceased boy's room carried that faint, hesitant scent of damp paper and old varnish, the kind that never quite releases its secrets. Lewis unlocked the door as if afraid it might resist. The room seemed even more immaculate than I remembered, though I suspected that was only the illusion created by daylight. Nothing was out of place. Nothing dared be. The narrow bed was made with a severity that felt almost punitive. The desk had been wiped clean of prints, and still that half-finished crossword rested in the same position as before, a small square of quiet defiance against the notion of suicide. I told Lewis that the living rarely arrange their final hours with such fastidious precision. He replied with a soft uncertainty, suggesting that perhaps the boy had been a tidy sort. I didn't argue, but something in the symmetry of the scene made the back of my mind tighten like a string pulled too far. I wandered toward the desk, noticing for the first time that one corner of the crossword page had absorbed a faint moisture ring, as though a glass had been placed upon it long after the ink dried. That detail settled uneasily inside me. Lewis mentioned that the college master wished to speak with us, and I suggested we oblige before the man dissolved into further anxiety. As we stepped into the corridor, the building offered a gentle groan, like an elderly scholar shifting in his sleep. The master received us in his study, a chamber overwhelmed by books whose spines bore the scars of too much pride. He spoke with that careful elegance Donish men adopt when their reputations might be at stake. He said the boy had shown no signs of distress. He said the death was a terrible shock to the college community. He said rather too many things that sounded rehearsed. When Lewis asked about the high table invitation torn in half, the master paused long enough for me to mark the hesitation as genuine discomfort. He claimed the invitations were a mere formality, though he added, almost reluctantly, that one invitation had indeed been withdrawn shortly before the feast. The name he gave belonged to a lecturer whose presence at the college had always caused minor disturbances of the academic kind. I watched him as he spoke, noting the faint twitch at the corner of his eye each time the student's name was mentioned. A harmless gesture, perhaps, or the first crack in a facade constructed on unsteady ground. When we left the study, I felt the master's relief trailing behind us like smoke. The lecturer in question, Dr. Helena Forrester, taught literature with the kind of precision that frightened duller minds. Her office carried the brittle scent of old paper mixed with an undercurrent of lavender, which I suspected was a deliberate attempt to soften her otherwise formidable presence. She greeted us with a composure that bordered on indifference. When I mentioned the withdrawn invitation, she shifted her gaze toward the window, a movement too fluid to be unconscious. She said she had removed herself from the feast for personal reasons. The phrasing, delicate and ambiguous, struck me as untrue in the way only emotionally intelligent lies can be. On her desk lay a row of books, arranged not alphabetically but thematically. One volume had a gap between it and the next, a gap wide enough to imply another book once rested there. I let my fingers drift over the dustless outline. Helena noticed her posture tightening, though she offered no explanation. Lewis, ever perceptive in his quiet way, asked whether she had known the student well. She said she had barely spoken to him, though her tone suggested a more complicated truth. I filed the contradiction away. As we walked back through the corridor, I felt the college stretching around us like a tapestry of half-hidden threads. The second-floor window looked out over the quad, now softened by rain. I told Lewis that the boy's death had been staged with a deliberation more suited to theater than despair. He asked what I meant. I pointed out that the crossword error was not the kind of mistake a bright student would make lightly, especially not one with a reputation for linguistic precision. It was, I suspected, an inserted imperfection, a clue disguised as incompetence. When we stepped outside, the drizzle had thinned into a delicate mist. Oxford has a habit of breathing differently when it wants to hide something. That morning, the city inhaled too slowly, as though guarding a truth not yet ready to be spoken aloud. I walked toward Helena Forrester's rooms with a sort of apprehension that never announced itself openly, but lingered instead, like a faint chill collecting behind the ribs. The drizzle had settled into that soft, persistent fall Oxford knows so well, turning every flagstone into a dim reflection of the world above it. St. Anselm's looked almost staged in that grey light, as though someone had asked the heavens for a backdrop adequate to the college's discomfort. I remember thinking, not for the first time, that academic beauty rarely travelled alone. It always brought a shadow. Her staircase smelled of wet wool coats and the faint sweetness of lavender polish, a curious mixture that somehow made the air feel narrower. When she opened the door, Helena appeared exactly as I'd imagined her the night before, self-contained, unflustered, and slightly amused by the intrusion. She gestured us inside with a softness that felt practiced. Lewis hovered behind me, uneasy in the presence of people who wield their intelligence like a blade. Her office was an elegant kind of disorder. Books stacked in thoughtful but unapologetic heaps, a shawl draped across a chair in a way that implied frequent use, and a single cup of tea still steaming faintly on the windowsill. The mist outside pressed against the panes, softening the view of the quad until it resembled an impressionist painting. Helena returned to her chair with the calm of someone who had already rehearsed every possible question we might ask. She told us she had withdrawn herself from the high-table feast. She did so with a serenity that made me distrust the explanation immediately. There was no accompanying irritation, no hint of reluctant compliance. I found myself thinking of the torn invitation on the student's desk and wondered who had been performing for whom. She described the feast as tiresome. She said she preferred solitude. She said she hadn't felt like being among colleagues. Each statement fits neatly into the next, polished and ready. Helena was a woman who curated her narrative with care. I noticed the missing book again, the gap between two volumes on her shelf, a void that seemed almost too intentional to ignore. The dust along the wooden lip confirmed what her expression tried to conceal. Something had been removed recently. I asked her about it in that gentle, conversational way I've found disarming over the years. She replied that she must have lent it to a student, though she couldn't recall which one. The tightness in her shoulders betrayed her. That small betrayal was more revealing than any confession. Lewis asked whether she had known the deceased boy well. Her answer arrived with the right volume of sympathy and the right measure of distance. Barely at all, she said. But the boy had been clever. Extremely clever. Too clever, she added, in the way people do when they intend the listener to ponder a second meaning. I watched her as she spoke, noting the subtle shift in her gaze each time she avoided a direct reference to him. Her eyes moved toward the window, then toward the spine of a book, then toward her hands. It was an evasive rhythm, not a careless one. On her desk lay a small notebook turned face down. A thin ribbon marked a page. I could see the faint indentation of handwriting pressing through the paper. I didn't ask about it, not then. Some questions must be left to ripen. Instead, I remarked upon the poem hanging framed above her desk, a verse she corrected as she recited it, as though too aware of her own knowledge. Except she didn't correct it correctly. She altered a line with such subtlety that I suspected she believed no one would notice. But misquoted poetry is a treacherous thing. It reveals more than it conceals. I filed the error away with the other quiet inconsistencies. When we stepped back out into the corridor, Lewis said she seemed reasonable enough. I told him reasonableness was often the first refuge of people hiding old guilt. He smiled uneasily, as though unsure whether I meant it as humor. Even I wasn't sure. We headed toward the library, its entrance framed by those flaking wooden beams that always reminded me of a cathedral trying to shrink itself. Inside, the air smelled of paper, dust, and a trace of something floral, perhaps, from an absent librarian with sentimental taste. I felt the usual spark that libraries trigger in me, a mixture of melancholy and recognition. The dead boy had spent hours here, according to the porter. I wondered which of these tables had carried his final thoughts, which books had shaped his suspicions. The reading room was empty, save for a single lamp left burning over a desk near the window. Its warm pool of light illuminated an open notebook abandoned beside a Latin dictionary. On the margin of one of the pages, someone had scribbled a phrase, a simple phrase, almost banal. But there was something oddly familiar in the lettering, a slight rightward slant, identical to that on the torn invitation. A detail small enough to ignore, but I couldn't. I traced the edge of the page with my thumb, feeling the paper's subtle roughness. Someone had been here very recently. As we left the library, the quiet seemed to deepen rather than fade. I felt the beginnings of a pattern forming faint, unresolved, but present. The withdrawn invitation, the missing diary, the misquoted poem, the neatness of the boy's room. Threads that refused to stay, separate. The rain outside had settled into a muted hush. I remember thinking as we crossed the quad that Oxford was holding its breath, and that somewhere behind one of these old windows, someone else was doing the same. I arrived at the high table feast with the sort of reluctant curiosity that accompanies most rituals in Oxford. The rain had eased by evening, leaving the cobblestones shining as though polished by unseen hands. Inside the hall, the air carried that peculiar mixture of beeswax, old wine, and starch that seems to hover eternally above ancient tables. The chandeliers hung like tired constellations, flickering with a weariness I felt in my own bones. Lewis walked beside me, stiff in his borrowed jacket, doing his best not to look as though he were counting the number of forks arranged before him. The feast was a feast only in name. The absence of Helena Forrester sat in the room more heavily than any empty chair. She should have been positioned near the provost, where the candlelight could have caught her expression and betrayed her intentions. Instead, her place remained untouched, a silver plate reflecting nothing but the wavering flame above it. The murmur of conversation drifted in muted waves along the table, each voice carefully moderated, as though the diners were afraid to disturb something fragile. I found myself watching the subtle movements of the dons. A glance exchanged too quickly, a hand tightened around a wine stem, a smile that never reached the eyes. Oxford has its own language, one built on hesitation and unspoken grievances. Helena's absence had disrupted the grammar. I leaned back slightly, listening to a lecturer mutter to his neighbor about indigestion, yet the tone suggested something altogether different. I wondered how often people dressed fear in the clothing of discomfort. When the provost rose for his obligatory speech, the hall became a reluctant sea of silence. His words glided across the room, praise for tradition, gratitude for scholars, a fleeting tribute to the deceased student that felt insufficient, even in its brevity. I noticed how his hand trembled when he lifted his glass, though his voice never faltered. A man used to delivering polished truths even when truths were unwelcome. He concluded with a toast that landed flatly, like a stone tossed into still water. It was during the first course that I noticed the wine lists, thin, cream-colored cards with an ornate border. Beautiful, but wrong. The design belonged to a style the college had abandoned years ago. I remembered the old list's florid lettering, indulgent embellishments. This one was an imitation of a memory, reproduced with meticulous care. I turned the card over, studying the faint embossing. Someone had gone to unnecessary, elaborate trouble. I whispered to Lewis that the list did not belong to this decade. He raised an eyebrow, though I could see his mind storing the details. The courses drifted by with mechanical precision. Roast duck carved without joy, a dessert too sweet to be honest. I noticed something else too. The conversations never lingered on the student's death. They skirted the subject with the sort of caution reserved for fragile reputations. A Latin tutor spoke quietly about the weather, then abruptly shifted to an anecdote of a library renovation. A historian corrected him unnecessarily. It was all forced, artificial, like a poorly rehearsed play performed by actors who wished they were elsewhere. Near the end of the meal, an elderly classical scholar leaned toward me. His breath carried the aftertaste of port and regret. He murmured that the boy had been asking too many questions. "Clever boy," he said. "Too clever." The words echoed Helena's earlier remark, and I felt the outline of a pattern sharpening. When I pressed him gently, he retreated into silence, gripping his fork as though it anchored him to safer ground. The hall felt increasingly oppressive. The laughter sounded brittle. The music from the small ensemble lacked conviction. I found myself staring at Helena's empty place setting. A smear of wax had dripped onto the linen near her plate, a small imperfection that almost seemed deliberate. I wondered whether she had left that mark earlier in the day or whether someone else had sought to simulate her presence. The thought unsettled me in ways I couldn't quite articulate. As the final toast faded, guests rose with that peculiar mixture of stiffness and relief. Chairs scraped against the floor, creating a chorus of weary resignation. I lingered behind, letting the room empty itself. In the silence that followed, the hall felt different, as though it had finally exhaled. I picked up Helena's untouched wine glass, noticing a faint ring of dust clinging to its base. It hadn't been poured that evening. It hadn't been touched for days. Lewis joined me, hands in his pockets, looking as though he'd been wrestling with some private discomfort. He mentioned that one of the kitchen staff had seen someone enter the hall early that morning. Not a don, not a student, someone she didn't recognize. I felt a quiet ripple of intrigue move through me. An outsider, or perhaps someone who had taken care to appear as one. We walked out into the night together, the air sharp with damp cold. The lamps cast long, slender shadows across the quad, their glow broken only by the faint tremor of mist gathering again. I told Lewis that the feast had revealed nothing openly, but that sometimes a lack of chaos revealed more. He asked me what I meant. I paused, listening to the soft rain against the stone. A feast without laughter, a wine list from another decade, and an empty seat that carried more weight than any presence. That is what we had been served. A performance. And someone, somewhere, was waiting for us to draw the wrong conclusion. There are moments in an investigation when the present feels thinner than it should, as though the air itself remembers something you have yet to discover. That morning, the sky hung low over Oxford, a flat grey lid pressing down upon the rooftops of St. Anselm's. Lewis walked beside me with the dogged quiet of a man chewing on a thought he did not yet trust. He told me he had found something in the college archives. Something small, but troubling. I've learned never to underestimate the quiet tremors of the past. The archivist, a thin man with the posture of someone who had been startled once too often by his own thoughts, handed Lewis a cardboard folder. Dust rose from it in a soft plume, catching the light from the narrow window above us. He said the contents had been misfiled. He said it with that tone of professional shame academics use when addressing an error they hope will be forgiven. I took the folder from him and opened it carefully. A single photograph lay inside an old school group portrait, 30 or so faces arranged with the rigid precision of a long-forgotten ceremony. What unsettled me was not the image itself, but the fact that 3 faces had been marked lightly in pencil. The student who had died, Helena Forrester, and the elderly classical scholar who had whispered to me at the feast. They stood in different rows, separated by half a decade in age, yet here they were bound together long before the events we were now trying to make sense of. I felt the familiar prick of unease beneath my sternum, the kind that suggested we were trespassing upon a story that had not wished to be retold. Lewis leaned closer, pointing out that the photograph had been printed twice. One print bore no markings at all, just the faces, the faded edges, the old-school crest. The second copy, the one in my hands, bore faint pencil notations, 2 versions, one public, one private. He asked me why someone would keep both. I told him people are never content with a single version of the truth. They bury the first, then resurrect the second when memory becomes inconvenient. I studied Helena's younger face in the photograph. She looked sharper, almost severe, even as a student, a mind already bracing itself against the world. The boy, years younger, stood in the bottom corner with a half-smile that seemed at odds with the grimness of the others. His eyes held that infuriating brightness some young men possess, the kind that makes them fearless in all the wrong ways. And the classical scholar, then a teacher, stood in the back row with the solemnity of someone who believed himself the custodian of something precious. I asked the archivist where he had found the marked copy. He hesitated before admitting it had been slipped inside a volume of poetry misshelved behind a row of dictionaries, a hiding place chosen by someone who knew the archive well, someone who understood that few would look for lyricism among reference books. A small deduction, but one that tugged at the thread of intention. As we walked back across the quad, the drizzle returned. It made the grass shine eerily, as though lit from beneath. Lewis, usually reluctant to speculate, suggested that Helena must have known the student far better than she claimed. I told him that a photograph is a treacherous thing. It captures a moment, not a relationship. But inwardly, I agreed with him more than I cared to admit. People rarely bury evidence of strangers. In Helena's office, she regarded the photograph with an expression so carefully arranged that its very poise betrayed her. She said she barely remembered the day it had been taken. She said the boy must have been attending some summer program. She said the scholar had been a colleague she had admired. The repetition of what she said drew an invisible curtain between us. Behind it, I sensed a tremor of old guilt, though its shape eluded me. Lewis noticed something I had missed. The shadow behind the boy was slightly blurred, as though someone had once tried to erase a figure from the image before abandoning the attempt. I watched Helena's eyes as she saw the same flaw. A tightening, a breath half held, a memory scraping lightly against her composure. When she returned the photograph to me, her fingers trembled just once, a fleeting betrayal of nerves. She asked whether it was relevant to the investigation. I told her relevance was a luxury we rarely recognized until too late. We left her staring at the empty gap on her bookshelf, where a missing diary should have been. The rain thickened as we stepped outside. Somewhere behind us, a door closed with quiet determination. It was the sound of a secret retreating deeper into the college. And I knew then that the photograph had not been buried twice. It had been buried repeatedly, by different hands, for different reasons. I have wondered, more times than is healthy, why an investigation sometimes feels most fragile precisely when it appears most complete. That morning, St. Anselm seemed determined to convince us we were nearing certainty. The quad glistened with the residue of an overnight rain, and the college cats prowled with that smug assurance only creatures unburdened by conscience possess. Lewis walked beside me with an unusual confidence, outlining the seemingly obvious motives of 3 separate dawns. I listened, though a part of me recoiled from the ease of it all. When answers arrive too neatly in Oxford, they rarely belong to the truth. We met the provost first. He greeted us with the forced geniality of a man rehearsing innocence. His study smelled of tobacco and something metallic, perhaps the residue of poorly polished silver. He admitted with a sigh, calibrated for sympathy, that the college's reputation had been strained by recent events. He spoke about the deceased student with gentle regret, then shifted seamlessly to Helena's withdrawn invitation, painting it as a minor administrative matter exaggerated by academic gossip. Lewis asked whether the student had confronted him with allegations. The provost hesitated just long enough to betray a thought he did not want examined, then insisted the boy had merely been over-enthusiastic in his research. When we left, Lewis announced that the provost's nerves all but proved his guilt. I told him nerves proved only humanity. It was a remark that earned me one of his disappointed glances, the kind he usually reserved for my more pessimistic observations. But I could not shake the sensation that our suspects felt selected for us, as though led into position by invisible hands. We spoke next with the classical scholar, the same man who had murmured to me at the feast. His room was a shrine to ancient languages, with papers scattered across his desk like fallen leaves. He greeted us with the melancholy of someone long accustomed to disappointment. He confessed that the boy had approached him with questions about Helena, questions that had left him uneasy. He claimed he had discouraged the boy. "Don't prod at old histories," he said. "The past is never grateful when disturbed." His voice trembled with a sincerity that made me distrust it all the more. When I asked why he had been marked in the school photograph, he stiffened, then offered an explanation too brittle to be believed. He said he had forgotten the boy entirely, yet the grief in his eyes suggested otherwise. Lewis grew increasingly convinced the man was hiding something significant, and perhaps he was. But not, I felt, the kind of truth that leads to murder. Some secrets are too personal to be dangerous to anyone except their keeper. By early afternoon, Helena's name had returned to our conversation like a persistent echo. Lewis argued she had the strongest motive, a past connection, a missing diary, the boy's supposed accusations. I hardly disagreed, yet some instinct tugged me away from her. Her lies, though real, felt protective rather than predatory. People like Helena withheld the truth not to deceive the world, but to preserve some fragile corner of themselves. I have met killers who hid behind rage, pride, or desperation. Helena hid behind silence. And silence, in my experience, often belongs to the wounded, not the guilty. We returned to the students' room, hoping a second look might loosen something the first had left untouched. The stillness in that narrow space felt heavier now. I studied the desk again, the half-finished crossword, the torn invitation, the neatness that masqueraded as calm. I told Lewis the room resembled a stage set. Every detail arranged, every imperfection chosen. He asked whether I believed someone had cleaned the room after the boy had died. I said I believed someone had cleaned the room long before that. It was the crossword that pulled me back. I traced the penciled letters, noticing for the first time that the erased attempts formed a faint but deliberate pattern, a repetition of one particular wrong answer, as though inserted by someone who wished to appear careless but lacked the imagination for real error. The mistake was too symmetrical, too consistent, a clue pretending to be confused. Lewis asked if this meant the boy had been murdered. I told him it meant someone wanted us to think he had died in a way that absolved them. But absolution, like everything in Oxford, is never freely given. We stepped outside just as the bells began to ring for the afternoon chapel. Their muted toll drifted across the quad, reverberating off stone in a way that made the entire college seem momentarily hollow. I paused, watching students move between lectures, unaware of the quiet architecture of deceit that threaded through their walls. Lewis asked who I suspected now. I could not answer. The provost hid fear, Helena hid sorrow, the scholar hid guilt, and every one of them fit the shape of a culprit too conveniently. The wrong suspects, I thought. Presented like exhibits, too visible, too human, too flawed to be true orchestrators of something so meticulously arranged. Somewhere behind their doubts, someone else waited. Someone who trusted we would focus our gaze on the most obvious shadows and ignore the dim corridor where the real figure stood, just beyond the reach of lamplight. There are corners of Oxford where time settles differently, where dust rests with the solemnity of forgotten prayers, and where footsteps echo as though the stones themselves are trying to recall the shapes of those who once walked there. The college archive was such a place. Lewis and I descended its narrow staircase in silence, our breath stirring the cold air like faint ghosts reluctant to disperse. The archivist had left the room unlocked for us, claiming he needed fresh air. I suspected he needed distance instead. The archive smelled of parchment, cardboard, and that peculiar dryness found only in places untouched by sunlight. I closed the door behind us and felt the hush embrace us in a way that was almost ceremonial. The shelves rose in tight rows, each one overburdened with the weight of centuries, letters that had outlived their writers, diaries that had tried to outlive their sins. Somewhere among them, I believed, lay something the student had uncovered. Something he should never have found. Lewis moved ahead with a reverence that made me oddly proud of him. He began checking the catalogue drawers while I wandered toward the poetry section, guided by nothing more than a lingering discomfort I couldn't quite name. Helena's missing diary page had reappeared too conveniently the day before. Pristine, neatly placed, almost proud of its own rediscovery. It smelled of recent ink, not old memory. Someone had planted it, and people who plant one thing often plant others. It was a faint smear of dust on the floor that drew my eye to an interrupted line, the kind left by an object recently shifted. I knelt beside it, ignoring the ache in my knees, and traced my finger along the outline. The indentation matched the size of a thin booklet. I told Lewis we were looking in the wrong place. He joined me, his brow furrowed in that earnest way he has, and together we followed the faint trail to the base of a shelf near the far wall. There, wedged behind a row of anthologies, was an envelope coated in a film of dust that had collected unevenly around the edges. I lifted it carefully. The paper crackled softly, the way paper does when it has waited too long to be read. The handwriting on the front was familiar, though I couldn't immediately place it, a slanting cursive, delicate yet oddly strained. Lewis asked whether we should open it. I told him some letters are more dangerous sealed than exposed. Inside was a single sheet folded twice. No date, no signature, just a fragment of confession written with hesitant strokes. It spoke of an incident decades earlier, a scandal never reported, a betrayal never acknowledged, a student ruined, a mentor protected. The words were vague, incomplete, almost apologetic, but the tone was unmistakable. It carried the sorrow of someone trying to explain their own cowardice without quite admitting it. Lewis suggested Helena must have written it, but her handwriting was smoother, more confident, less tremulous. I studied the slant again. A detail fluttered at the edge of memory, something from the wine list at the feast, or perhaps from the provost's notes. I could not place it, and the inability irritated me. A deduction half-formed is a wound that refuses to close. I refolded the letter and slipped it back into the envelope. As I did, a small puff of dust rose from the floor, catching the lamplight in a brief, shimmering gesture. It reminded me of the faint dust I had seen on Helena's unused wine glass, the kind that collects when an object is present but untouched. There was a parallel there, though its purpose remained elusive. Lewis wandered toward a table in the corner, where an open ledger lay surrounded by loose scraps of catalogue paper. He pointed out that several entries had been rewritten in a different hand, the ink noticeably fresher than the rest. Someone had altered the records, rearranging the past with the precision of a scholar and the caution of a criminal. I told him alterations rarely aim to hide a large truth. They hide a small one, something that seems insignificant until it becomes fatal. We carried the envelope upstairs, intending to compare the handwriting with that of our suspects. As we stepped into the corridor, a faint draught brushed against us, stirring loose particles from the stairwell. The college around us felt hollow, as though bracing itself against some unspoken admission. I wondered if the person who had hidden the letter had done so out of fear, or love, or some fragile blend of both. Outside, the sky sagged with a heavy, indifferent grey. The trees in the quad swayed reluctantly, their branches whispering to each other with the secrecy of conspirators. Lewis asked whether the letter changed everything. I told him it changed nothing, and everything because truth rarely arrives fully. It comes in torn pages, misplaced photographs, dust-coated envelopes. As we walked back toward the main hall, I felt the weight of the letter against my coat. It was a light thing, barely noticeable, yet it seemed to tug at me like an old regret resurfacing after years of being politely ignored. And in that moment, I understood not the meaning, not the culprit, not the hidden logic, but the unmistakable sensation that the past was beginning to unearth itself, whether we were ready or not. The news reached us not with urgency, but with the soft dread of something inevitable. A don from St. Anselm's, one of the quieter ones, the sort of man whose presence fades into the walls he walks beside, had collapsed in the senior common room shortly after 11's. The porter's voice on the phone sounded strangely calm, as though the college had been expecting a second tragedy and merely awaited the hour at which it would choose to arrive. Lewis and I made our way through the narrowing drizzle, the sky stooping low enough to brush against the highest gables. Inside, the corridor leading to the common room smelled faintly of burnt toast and damp wool. The air felt thickened by secrets, as though the walls themselves had absorbed too many quiet confessions over the years. A cluster of dons stood in uneasy silence, their expressions pinned somewhere between grief and dread. Lewis knelt beside the fallen man, Professor Tillwater, whose face had settled into a stillness almost peaceful. His cup of sherry lay on its side, forming a delicate amber halo around the stem. A scene too gentle for death, which made it all the more sinister. I crouched beside him and observed the faint discoloration along his lips, a shade that did not belong to natural causes. The sherry itself emitted nothing unusual, yet something in the air felt altered, an absence rather than a presence. Lewis murmured that the medic had declared it heart failure. I told him heart failure was convenient, but convenience seldom aligned with truth. He asked what I thought had happened. I replied only that death rarely arrives quietly without help when guilt is watching. The room was cluttered in that scholarly way that mistakes disorder for depth. Books lay half open on tables, papers curled at their corners, and the fire in the grate struggled against its own fading embers. In the corner, a window dripped steadily, the condensation forming a blurred reflection of the scene inside. I moved toward the sherry decanter and lifted it gently. Its weight, oddly enough, felt inconsistent, as though the liquid inside did not move with the viscosity I expected. A small deduction, but one that whispered to me in the cold hush of the room. Lewis stood, brushing his hands against his trousers in that nervous way he had when confronted by a puzzle without an immediate edge to grasp. He said the deceased had been seen talking to the student only days before the boy's death. The statement hung between us like a half-finished sentence. I asked who had poured the sherry. The porter said no one had noticed. People helped themselves at that hour, sir. I nodded, though the words struck me with the faint chill of something rehearsed. We stepped outside a moment later, the corridor dimly lit by windows shrouded in mist. The rain had softened, but its rhythm against the stone felt heavier somehow. Lewis wondered aloud whether the professor had known too much. I replied that knowing too much rarely killed a man in Oxford. Knowing just enough to trouble someone else, that was what proved fatal. We walked toward the student staircase once more, the landscape of the college shifting subtly with every step. The air smelled of wet leaves and the faint, coppery trace of decay. I felt a quiet dread forming in me, the sort that grows not from fear, but from the recognition that something intricate has begun to unravel. The photograph, the letter in the dust, the wine list from another decade, Helena's careful lies. Each piece tugged gently at a thread that now felt dangerously close to snapping. In the boys' room, nothing had changed. The bed remained too neat, the desk too still, the crossword too deliberate in its wrongness. I sat beside the desk and let my fingers drift across the surface. A thin layer of dust clung to the corner of the torn invitation. Yet the rest of the desk remained spotless. I murmured to Lewis that death had moved through this room twice. Once for the student, once again for the truth. He asked me what I meant. I told him someone had returned after we'd left. The dust bore traces of a hand smoothing its surface, a gesture small enough to escape notice unless one had spent years observing the domestic betrayals of guilty rooms. Someone had reached for something on the desk. Perhaps the missing letter. Perhaps the envelope we discovered in the archive had not been the only one. We returned to the corridor. The staircase creaked beneath our weight, as though echoing the discomfort of the building itself. It struck me then how death alters the pulse of a place. After the student's death, the college had become watchful. After Tillwater's, it had begun to tremble. Lewis paused midway down the stairs and asked whether I thought the two deaths were connected. I told him they were connected in the way two knots in a rope are connected by the same hand, though spaced far apart. When we stepped out into the quad, the mist had grown thicker, softening the shapes of the cloisters until they seemed to retreat from us. The college bell rang from somewhere unseen, a muted toll that felt like a warning rather than a summons. A second death, quiet as breath, and yet the silence around it was louder than anything we had heard so far. There are nights when a case seems to double back on itself, as though the truth were walking just ahead of me, glancing over its shoulder with faint amusement. That evening, the sky above Oxford sagged in a heavy, colourless smear, and the lamps flickered with the exhaustion of too many rain-soaked days. Lewis and I had returned to my office with the envelope, the photograph, and the fading certainty that anything we believed still resembled coherence. I remember sitting there, listening to the quiet thrum of the radiator, feeling the weight of a detail I had missed pressing against me like an unwelcome hand on the shoulder. Lewis had gone to fetch tea, leaving me with the crossword we had found in the student's room. I flattened the page beneath my palm and studied the faint traces of erasure. The boy had made the same incorrect answer twice too neatly, too deliberately. It was not the mistake that troubled me, but the handwriting. A slight rightward slant, gentle curves at the tail of the letters. Familiar. Infuriatingly familiar. And yet I could not place it. It drifted at the edge of memory like a song half forgotten. When Lewis returned, he saw the expression on my face and asked what had changed. I told him nothing had changed, which meant everything had. I explained that handwriting rarely lies. People rehearse their voices, rearrange their memories, polish their alibis, but handwriting always whispers their habits. The boy's crossword had not been written in his own hand, or rather, not entirely. Someone had guided it, perhaps not physically, but rhythmically, an imitation with subtle deviations. A detail I should have caught long before. We walked back to St. Anselm's through the encroaching dusk, the pavement shining like dark glass beneath our steps. The college loomed ahead, its windows dim and watchful. Inside the library, the air hung heavily with the scent of parchment and the faint sweetness of floor polish. I made for the table where we had found the notebook days earlier. The lamp above it glowed with a warm isolation, casting the same soft shadow over the torn catalogue slips. I told Lewis to bring me the wine list from the feast, the one with the ornate border that belonged to another decade. He unfolded it on the desk, and there it was. The handwriting at the bottom is the list of vintages scribbled by someone in a hurry. The same slight slant, the same softened curves, the same quiet attempt to disguise refinement as haste. A signature written not in ink, but in habit. I felt a tightening inside me, the kind that accompanies recognition more than revelation. The hand that had written the wine notes was the same hand that had written the incorrect crossword clue. Lewis asked whose hand it was. I said I wasn't sure, though the truth was already taking shape, steady and inevitable. We carried the wine list to the archive, where the faint smell of dust and neglected memory greeted us once more. The archivist, startled by our arrival, hurried to meet us with an anxious smile. He tried to hide it, but the tremor in his voice betrayed curiosity mixed with something darker. I asked him to show us the catalogue ledger again, the one with the rewritten entries. He complied with an eagerness too willing to please. When he opened the ledger, the truth settled around us like falling ash. The handwriting in the rewritten entries matched the wine list. It matched the crossword. It matched the faint, slanting script on the dust-covered envelope we had found hidden behind the poetry. A thread connecting 3 lies, all bound by the same careful hand. Lewis exhaled sharply, as though struck by a sudden cold. He murmured that it couldn't be the archivist. I replied that quiet men with unobtrusive habits often build the most elaborate disguises. The archivist watched us with an expression that tried to cloak itself in confusion, but something in his eyes flickered. Recognition, perhaps, or resignation. I could not yet tell. But guilt has a posture all its own, and his shoulders had begun to sag beneath its weight. We stepped away from him, pretending to confer in private. I told Lewis that the archivist had been near every corner of the case. The letter hidden in dust, the misfiled photograph, the reappearing diary page. His proximity had seemed benign at first, but the wrongness now grew too luminous to ignore. Lewis asked why the student would have confronted him. I said that some men spent their whole lives guarding a secret buried so deeply they no longer remembered the first lie that protected it. We left the archive without accusation. The truth, once felt, does not always need to be spoken. Outside, the wind moved through the quad with the hush of an old confession finally stirring. Lewis looked at me expectantly. I told him the clue had been there from the beginning, the slanted handwriting, echoing across documents separated by decades, a small, almost tender imperfection. And as we crossed beneath the cloisters, I realized the truth had been waiting for me long before I was ready to see it. I have never trusted endings. They arrive too softly, too politely, as though reluctant to admit what they have taken from us. That evening, when Lewis and I walked back to St. Anselm's for the final time, the sky had begun its slow collapse into dusk. The lamps along the cloister flickered in long, uncertain lines, making the shadows seem stretched, exhausted. Oxford does not welcome conclusions. It tolerates them only because time insists. I carried the wine list in my coat pocket, its edges softened by handling, its falseness now unmistakable. The archivist had not expected us to recognize the hand that shaped its useless nostalgia, the slanted letters, the careful curves. A man who catalogued the past for a living should have known that memory is the most dangerous forgery. Lewis walked a step behind me, quiet in the way he becomes when certainty bruises him. We found the archivist in the upper reading room, where he sat alone beneath a failing lamp, surrounded by the ruins of old indexing cards. He looked up with a gentleness that almost undid me. Some men wear their guilt like armor, others wear it like a thinning coat. He belonged to the latter. I told him we needed to speak. The words felt too loud in that delicate space where dust floated like hesitant punctuation. He asked whether this was about the boy, or perhaps about Tillwater. His voice wavered on the second name. cracking at the edges. I realized then he had liked Tillwater, or feared him. The two emotions often travel together in such places. I placed the wine list, the ledger entries, and the crossword sheet on the table before him. The archive seemed to bend inward, listening with a curiosity older than any of us. He closed his eyes, and at that moment Oxford felt terribly small. He spoke quietly, describing the mistake he had made decades earlier, merging two academic records to shield a mentor whom the college had nearly destroyed. A minor fraud, he said, barely more than a correction. But the student had found the discrepancy, asked questions, brought old evidence with that brightness of conviction reserved for the young. The archivist had panicked. He admitted he had tried to suggest the boy had misread the records. When that failed, he had fabricated a diary page, hoping to distract him with a tantalizing yet meaningless clue. Lewis stiffened at that. I remained seated. Guilt has its own gravity standing and does nothing to change its orbit. The archivist said the boy had come to him late one evening, waving the torn invitation from the high-table feast. The discrepancy in the guest list had connected neatly to the old scandal. He'd threatened to bring the matter to the provost. Or perhaps to Helena. The archivist couldn't remember, or wouldn't. I watched his hands tremble not dramatically, but with the fragile cadence of a man who had not slept honestly in years. He told us he hadn't meant to kill the student. He had visited the boy's room only to retrieve the forged letter he feared would expose him, but the argument grew heated. The boy collapsed, whether from shock or an unseen weakness of the heart. He insisted he didn't know. He tried to revive him. Failed. And in the hollow that followed, panic took hold. He staged the desk, tore the invitation to mislead us, planted the crossword mistake because he could imitate handwriting better than he could control his fear. Tillwater, he added, had confronted him days later. The professor had recognized the old forgery style, perhaps from some shared memory. Tillwater had been kind, but determined. He would have reported it, and so the archivist had slipped poison into the sherry, using a vintage no one would question at that hour. A quiet death for a quiet man, he said. His voice cracked when he said, quiet. Lewis reached instinctively for his cuffs. I told him to wait. The archivist looked at me then with a weariness that seemed almost grateful. He asked whether I hated him. I told him hatred was a luxury reserved for people who choose cruelty over fear. He nodded, though I doubted he believed me. When we escorted him through the quad, the night had deepened into a color between indigo and resignation. The windows of the college glowed faintly, their yellow squares trembling in the damp air. The archivist paused once, glancing back toward the library with the longing of someone leaving a sanctuary he had poisoned by living in it too long. After he was taken away, Lewis and I remained beneath the cloister. The damp breeze carried the faint scent of old paper, dust, and something that felt almost like regret. He asked whether justice had been done. I told him justice never arrives cleanly in Oxford. It arrives tangled in memory, softened by sympathy, blurred by the tender failings of human nature. As we walked toward the gate, I felt the folded wine list in my pocket again. The invitation that should never have been written. A single piece of paper that had tried to bridge decades and in doing so had broken more lives than it could ever have honored. And in the hush of that fading night, I realized the invitation carried not just a lie, but the echo of people who desperately wanted to be forgiven by a past that never forgives.